In recent weeks, individuals around the globe have watched the novel coronavirus epidemic, which began in Wuhan, China, and has now spread to over 180 countries, causing 2,638,852 confirmed cases and 184,248 reported deaths across the globe as of April 23, 2020. COVID-19, the disease caused by the novel coronavirus, first appeared in the United States in early March and has rapidly grown to over 856,057 cases and 47,269 deaths in the USA, with states New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts being hit the hardest. Drastic measures have been taken across the country in order to slow the spread of the virus, and over 40% of the American population is now under stay-at-home orders issued by either state or local governments. Only essential personnel, such as healthcare workers, grocery store employees, and those involved with state and national security, are permitted to work under these provisions, and gatherings of 10 or more have become illegal, enforceable by fines or jail time.
While United States citizens adjust to a new way of life, many have concerns about making ends meet as they can no longer work, and the stock market plunged over 10,000 points in 6 weeks. Businesses considered non-essential have also had to shutter their doors and face uncertainty about when they will be allowed to reopen. As a result, legislators in Washington have been working to create an economic stimulus package in order to stop the economy's looming decline. Republican Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell introduced legislation on Thursday, March 19th, which would bring $350 billion to small business, $500 billion in loans and loan guarantees to businesses, states, and cities, $250 billion for state unemployment programs, $100 billion for hospital infrastructure, and $250 billion in direct payments to many American citizens.
House and Senate Democrats took issue with the bill, some calling it a slush fund aimed at favoring certain companies and corporate executives while failing to provide assurances for the workers these firms may lay off. Democrat House Speaker Nancy Pelosi introduced her own bill on Monday, March 23rd, which focused on increasing payments to Americans as well as state and local aid. However, critics have accused Pelosi of pushing for corporate accountability measures that would last long after the coronavirus crisis is over, as well as environmental regulations that were originally included in the Green New Deal, legislation Pelosi and her party have long supported. Additional provisions in the bill appear unrelated to the crisis at all. There are new emissions requirements for airlines in order to receive federal grants, banning corporations that receive coronavirus relief loans from lobbying the federal government, and instituting a $15 minimum wage applicable to businesses that take relief funds.
With the threat of a recession forecasted to be potentially worse than the Great Depression looming on the horizon as a consequence of the coronavirus, one may be tempted to believe that partisan concerns would be placed aside in order to reach a deal before the deadline. However, as witnessed, this has not been the case, and legislators have squabbled for days over the best course of action, as well as provisions that would benefit their supporters, to be included in the economic stimulus package. Log rolling refers to favor trading that occurs between politicians and is used to gain majority support for policies and programs that legislators would like to have passed. Implicit log rolling happens when a bill is written in such a way that it combines many programs and projects, often unrelated to another, in order to build in support for the bill. This phenomenon was witnessed with the introduction of Nancy Pelosi's legislation this past week, with provisions unrelated to the coronavirus crisis being added in. Andrea Saron provides an explanation with the theory that even though the House remains a Democratic majority, factions still exist within the party, and lower unity within political parties will lead to important costs, as parties will mobilize resources to satisfy some of its factions to avoid a party fission. Party leaders choose to either mobilize internal resources of the party or target public spending towards issues important to the factions. Politicians calling the earlier bipartisan efforts at legislation a slush fund were likely the targets of these provisions, so as to avoid inter-party strife and gain majority support.
Legislative bargaining was established by both James Buchanan and Gordon Tullock, and posits that having established that collective choice decisions under rules requiring less than unanimous consent can lead to outcomes which are inefficient from the majority's point of view, some parts of the budget would be irrationally large and others irrationally small. From this, one can draw the conclusion that there is room for rational amounts of government spending on any one budget item, such as enforcing airline CO2 emissions or minimum wage requirements.
It can certainly be argued that the novel coronavirus has caused a time of national instability, both economically and politically. Economist Kenneth Shelps theorizes that the properties of pure majority rule and the institutions it is a part of, such as the U.S. Congress, imply that the stability of legislative outcomes is tenuous and unstable as well. He states that no form of log rolling, whether implicit or explicit, coalition formation, or individual bargaining, can eliminate the inherent instability that follows from the non-existence of a majority rule equilibrium. Log rolling provides no new opportunities for equilibrium within the system that the U.S. Congress operates under, and in fact exacerbates the instability it faces already. In the case of the coronavirus economic stimulus package, the lack of restrictions on Pelosi to bring forward alternatives to McConnell's bill accounts for the instability and delays we have seen in the past weeks. Legislators understood that the stimulus package would eventually get passed, which gave individuals the opportunity to hold out and bargain for provisions that were long-standing agenda items or provide benefits to their supporters. Where McConnell's bill has seen bipartisan support nearing a majority, the ability to log roll, present alternatives, and hold fast until these provisions were included compromised the legislative efforts to reach a deal prior to the March 25th deadline.
In addition to log rolling, rent-seeking behavior has played a large role in the legislative process since it had begun to unfold at the start of the novel coronavirus crisis. Rent-seeking refers to the act of allocating scarce resources in order to influence the political process to obtain an above-average rate of return, typically in the form of government privilege. Perhaps the biggest rent-seekers in the debate surrounding economic stimulus legislation are large corporations, airlines, banks, and industries hit hard by the novel coronavirus. These institutions seek government funding in the form of loans, direct payments, as they have lost significant amounts of business since the start of the pandemic. This crisis is expected to cost the international airline industry over $314 billion, leading these corporations to engage in rent-seeking behavior in hopes of being included in the bill. As a result, $25 billion was earmarked for airlines in the stimulus bill, and as of April 23, 2020, most major airlines have agreed to the terms in order to receive their share of funding.
Politicians themselves are engaging in rent-seeking behavior. However, the rents they are gunning for come in the form of votes needed to be re-elected instead of federal funding. While politicians' desire to be re-elected is not a new phenomenon, the coronavirus stimulus package has provided them with a new avenue to appeal to their respective constituencies by seeking to include provisions that would provide voters with benefits. The American people have vocalized calls for direct deposits from federal government to offset lost wages and unpaid bills, and as it is an election year, legislators have taken these concerns under great consideration. The institutions within a society themselves define the nature and rules of the game, Tulloch, but how it is played depends largely on the players themselves. Culture provides the lens through which people decipher their worlds and formulate plans. If a culture of rent-seeking exists in a society, the members of that society will view at least some forms of rent-seeking as legitimate avenues for achieving economic success. Legislators in the United States have long witnessed and participated in the culture of rent-seeking within the federal government and have engaged in this behavior countless times. Although it is not direct economic success they are seeking, rent-seeking culture has long played a role in American legislation and provides these individuals with the votes needed to remain employed by the federal government. With unemployment applications increasing by the millions since the beginning of March and small businesses being forced to shutter, it is understandable that lawmakers have sought to include provisions that will benefit voters in hopes that they will pay off come election time later this year.
While environmental policy is perhaps the furthest thing from the American people's mind at the moment, it has become a topic of conversation due to CO2 emissions provisions regarding airlines in Pelosi's economic stimulus legislation. Airlines would receive $37 billion in grants to keep workers employed, but in order to get funding would have to begin offsetting their carbon emissions by 2025 and reduce their overall emissions by 50% by 2050. The objective of pollution regulation and transparency in recent years is the maximization of social welfare by combating climate change, and usually can take the form of price controls, emissions taxes, or quantity controls, cap and trade markets. Pelosi's scheme does not fall under either category of standard pollution regulation. However, rents in the form of potentially contested public funds are also created through price regulation. It is unclear what industry is seeking rents from this provision, but pundits are speculating that climate change activists, those in the alternative energy sector, and advocates for the Green New Deal played a part in shaping the legislation.
While some argue that much of the rent-seeking behavior engaged in is directed at increasing the public good and avoiding the decline of the United States economy into the next Great Depression, the bill is costing taxpayers $16,000 per person, and the average individual is only receiving $1,200 to $2,000 in benefits. It is not yet clear that the funds allocated in the bill are being spent in ways that will prevent job loss or generate benefits that are greater than the costs. As it is an election year, many of our elected representatives, including President Donald Trump, have already or will come up for re-election, and how they handle the crisis has the potential to dictate the future of their political careers. In order to be elected in the coming months, political parties are tempted to appeal to powerful interest groups by offering and selling policies of various forms and scope in exchange for their votes and other considerations. Nancy Pelosi's policy demonstrates an attempt to not only appeal to the American populace as a whole, but specifically to Democratic voters who feel the need to implement the policies she included that seem to have no relation to the issue at hand. This coalition of shared interests has proved strong enough to put legislation into place, but nearly into gridlock at the same time due to the fact that every interest group, along with our political allies, marshals a fierce defense in support of their budgetary items, and against the objections that countervailing interest groups and other powers raise.
As of Wednesday, March 25, 2020, Nancy Pelosi's novel coronavirus aid bill was passed unanimously by the Senate, with the House of Representatives following suit. The $2 trillion stimulus package is the largest emergency aid package in United States history. At the time of this writing, the United States is the global leader for confirmed cases and deaths of COVID-19, with thousands more expected to follow. In a press conference on March 25th, Pelosi made it clear to those that were disappointed about priorities left out of the pending bill that they will have a chance to add those provisions in an up-and-coming fourth aid package aimed at recovering from the pandemic.
Ultimately, the provisions for airline carriers to curb carbon emissions were dropped from the legislation. However, this legislation is an important study in log rolling and rent seeking, especially during a time of crisis. This, along with other provisions mentioned previously, demonstrate that partisan politics never rests, even during a global crisis. Advocating for the public good, though seemingly straightforward at first glance, has proven to be difficult, particularly at such a massive scale, as politicians, journalists, and citizens alike all have different notions about the correct strategy we should undertake. The effects of this legislation will be long-stretching and not immediately known, as the nation remains under lockdown. The coming weeks and months will be telling as to whether or not our representatives made the correct decision or not.